9 Times Death Missed Lincoln, Episode 3, The Hat That Saved a Nation. He didn't see the shooter. He didn't hear the shot. But when the dust settled, there was a bullet hole through his hat, and the president was still alive. Chapter 1: A Ride Through Fog. The night air was thick with mist, the kind that blurs the world into suggestion. Trees leaned forward like eavesdropping strangers. Gravel cracked softly beneath hooves, and the moon, half covered by drifting clouds, cast just enough light to make the shadows look alive. Abraham Lincoln rode alone. It was late, after 10. The city behind him, the soldiers' home ahead, a route he had taken many times before. Familiar, predictable, too predictable. He wore no overcoat. Despite the chill, his stovepipe hat sat firmly atop his head. Tall as ever, absurdly so in the darkness. A single guard had offered to accompany him earlier that evening. Lincoln had declined. "I'm not worth guarding," he had said, "and if I were, God would do a better job than any man." The guard hadn't laughed, but Lincoln had smiled as he mounted the horse and waved. Now, on the road, he was a silhouette, a 6'4" figure on horseback, cutting through mist like a whisper too important for daylight. He wasn't alone, not really. Somewhere in the trees, someone waited, with a rifle. The road curved, just slightly, past a stone wall cracked with age. To the left, a slope. To the right, a thicket of bare-limbed oaks. The ideal place for an ambush, if you knew the routine. And someone did. The shot came without warning. A single, sharp crack in the fog. The horse reared. Lincoln gripped tight. The hat flew from his head. "Whoa now," he muttered, pulling the reins, calming the animal. No second shot, no shouting, just wind. He dismounted, breath steady, and walked back a few steps. There it was, lying on the gravel, his hat. He picked it up, dusted it off, and frowned. There was a hole, clean, sharp, burned at the edges, through the crown, right through the center. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, just as calmly, he put it back on, remounted, and rode on. He said nothing to anyone. The next morning, the stable hand found the hat on a bench outside the barn. He brought it in, worried he'd be blamed for damaging it. Lincoln smiled when he saw the concern. "Some poor fellow shot at me in the dark," he said, and missed. Then he laughed, but the stable hand didn't, because the angle of the shot and the size of the hole suggested it hadn't missed by much. In fact, it had missed by less than an inch. And Lincoln hadn't ducked. He had simply been sitting taller in the saddle. Or so they hoped. Later that day, a private conversation took place between the president and Ward Lamon, his friend and unofficial bodyguard. Lamon was one of the few men Lincoln allowed to speak to him directly about threats. "You could have been killed," Lamon said, holding the hat. Lincoln shrugged. "Could have been, wasn't. You need more protection. I need less routine. This wasn't random. Nothing ever is." He paused, but still, he missed. That phrase stuck. He missed. 3 letters short of history. At MetaFacts Legends, we believe the near misses are where the real stories hide. The bullet that lands is loud. The one that doesn't, whispers. This whisper changed everything. Because behind the joke, behind the deflection, something deeper was at play. Lincoln knew he had been targeted. Again, this wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. But this one felt different. It wasn't public, it wasn't dramatic, it was private, personal, designed not to send a message, but to end a man. Soldiers' Home was a quiet place, a retreat, just 3 miles from the White House, where Lincoln often went to escape the stifling air of Washington and the constant pressure of war. He walked there, rode there, even slept there during the summer months. And the road was always the same, unescorted, unwatched. That had been the point. Freedom, he believed, had to be lived, even under threat, especially under threat. But someone had known that. Someone had timed the shot not for spectacle, but for silence. Because if it had hit, there would have been no crowd, no chaos, just a man slumped over on horseback, found hours later by a passing patrol. No theater, just death. And yet, it missed. By inches. Why? That's the question that haunts us. And that's where this chapter begins. Because this wasn't just a bullet. It was a message, written in smoke, meant for one man, and one man only. What followed in the hours after was telling. Lincoln gave no statement, issued no order, but he didn't take the same road home that evening. And the next night, he rode with a different hat. Shorter, less iconic, easier to miss. Was that vanity or caution? His valet, William Slade, later wrote in a letter. The tall hat returned to its hook for nearly a week. The president did not explain why, but he walked more slowly and stood a little farther from the windows. The shot had landed, not in flesh, but in thought. That's where fear lives, not in wounds, but in possibilities. The next day, a military scout was dispatched, quietly, to walk the road. To look for signs. He found none. No footprints, no shell casing, just a single tree with a branch freshly broken, 6 feet from the ground. In the split wood, embedded at a shallow angle, a lead fragment, flattened, deformed. It matched the caliber used in Army-issue rifles. But the Army hadn't been there, at least, not officially, and this is where the mystery deepens. Because records later revealed that a soldier had gone absent without leave 2 days before the shooting. Private James Stillman, excellent marksman, known for his political rants, described by his commanding officer as disillusioned and hard to track. He returned to base 2 days after the shooting. No questions asked, reassigned to mess duty. He vanished from the Army rolls 4 weeks later. Discharged. Reason? Unspecified. Stillman never spoke publicly, but his name appears in a letter from another soldier, written in August 1864. Stillman says the president wears the devil's hat. One day he'll take it off for good. No investigation was opened, no charges filed. The incident with the hat remained unofficial, an almost death, filed away with the others. And yet, even in silence, it left a trace, because the hat survived. For years, it remained in Lincoln's personal effects, until 1911, when it was catalogued and stored by the Library of Congress. The hole was still there, clean, scented, measured by curators to be precisely 0.58 inches across. The exact diameter of a mini-A ball. Standard issue. That hat now rests behind glass. Tourists take photos. Children laugh. But the hole remains. Not just in felt, but in the story. The gap where a life should have ended, and didn't. At MetaFacts Legends, we follow the holes. We follow the silences. The inches that separate life and death. Because that's where truth hides. In the near miss. The unsaid. The breath before the bullet. And so, we ask again, who fired that shot? Why? And what if they hadn't missed? That's where we're headed next. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The hat with a hole. The hat sat on a table. Black, tall, slightly misshapen from use, the lining worn thin, but unmistakably Lincoln's. It didn't look like a battlefield relic. It didn't carry blood. It didn't smell of smoke. But it was wounded, right through the crown. Slightly off-center was a hole, burned at the edges, punched clean through the felt. You couldn't miss it, but Lincoln had. He found the hat the next morning, lying on the stable bench. At first, he thought it had fallen from a hook, but when he lifted it, he paused. Now that's strange, he muttered, turning the crown toward the light. Seen someone took a liberty with my head. He didn't call a guard, didn't summon Lamont. He just smiled, shook his head, and placed the hat gently back down. The stable hand, unsure of what to say, offered, "Sir, there's a hole in it." Lincoln nodded. "I'm aware someone had poor aim." Later that morning, he wore a different hat. No one questioned it. The shot hadn't drawn blood. The president hadn't fallen. There were no witnesses, just a hat with a hole, and the silence that grew louder by the hour. By midday, the story had spread, in hushed tones, among aides, across corridors, between cups of coffee and bundles of dispatches. "They shot at him," someone whispered. "No, just a hat," but it was on his head. He laughed about it. He laughed. He said, "Missed me by an inch," which in politics is practically a mile. That quote may have been apocryphal, but it spread like wildfire, because people needed to believe that Lincoln was untouchable, invulnerable, not because he was a god, but because the nation couldn't afford to lose him. Not yet. MetaFacts Legends retrieved 5 independent diary entries from individuals in the White House that day. Each one mentions the hat. 3 describe Lincoln's calm. 1 describes his silence. 1, written by Cook, says simply, "He stared at the hole like he recognized it." What does that mean? Recognized it. We believe Lincoln wasn't just looking at damage. He was looking at intention, at the precision, at how close it had come. Because this wasn't the first time, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But still, he said nothing publicly. No statement, no proclamation, no tightening of security. When his friend Leonard Swett visited him that evening and saw the damaged hat resting on a shelf, he asked, "Is this what I think it is?" Lincoln gave him a tired look. "It's exactly that, and exactly nothing." Swett frowned. "That's not funny. It's not a joke. You could have died." Lincoln didn't answer at first. Then, softly, "A man can't live afraid of inches, because eventually, one of them wins." The hat was placed in a box, stored, left alone, but it wasn't forgotten. Days later, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton confronted Lincoln privately. He had heard rumors, enough of them to be alarmed. He walked into the president's study and placed both hands on the desk. "I need to know if it's true." Lincoln looked up from a letter. "If what's true? The hat, the hole, the shot." A pause. "Don't me. Tell me." Lincoln stood, walked to the bookshelf, pulled down the box, opened it. Inside, the hat, hole visible, unmistakable. Stanton's face went pale. "Mr. President," Lincoln interrupted, "if someone is determined to kill me, they will. I cannot hide from every shadow. You can at least stop walking straight into them." Lincoln smiled. "But shadows are where my country is, and I'd rather walk through them than watch them grow." Stanton left the room furious, but powerless, because Lincoln wasn't a man you protected. He was a man you watched walk away, again and again, into danger, and prayed he returned. The hat remained shelved, but the hole, it widened, not physically, symbolically. It became a wound in the imagination of the nation. If they could shoot at Lincoln, miss by inches, what else could happen? What if next time they didn't miss? The fear didn't paralyze the government, but it did wake them. Suddenly, there were conversations behind doors, new patrol routes, informal watches, unofficial men placed in unofficial spots. No one said why, but everyone knew. MetaFacts Legends uncovered telegrams dated just after the hat incident, messages that referenced a security lapse to be corrected without publicity. One mentions a reminder of vulnerability, not to be discussed in writing. This wasn't just about a hat. It was about the idea that the president was killable, that history could shift in a heartbeat, from bloodless to broken. But Lincoln, he returned to his routines. Walked alone, rode alone, wore his new hat, until one night, weeks later, he returned to the old one. Whole and all. An aide asked why. Lincoln said, "It fits. Simple, final, as if the bullet hadn't just missed, but had been absorbed, accepted, respected, like it had given the hat new weight. Not as fashion, as memory. That hat now rests in a museum. The hole is still there. People peer in, point, pose for photos, but few understand what they're seeing. Not just a hat, not just a hole, but a moment, a near death, a breath between chapters, a pause in the page of history." And perhaps that's the strangest part, that a shot meant to end a life instead became a relic. A souvenir, proof not of mortality, but of survival. At MetaFacts Legends, we don't just tell stories of what happened, we trace what almost did, because in those inches, those near misses, we find the shape of history itself. And sometimes, it's soul. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3: The Man with No Orders. The rifle was clean, the uniform pressed, the boots scuffed, but polished as best as a private could manage. Private Nathaniel Greer stood at his post just outside the western trail leading to the soldier's home. He had stood there every evening for 2 weeks, on unofficial duty, under informal instructions, with no clear chain of command. That wasn't unusual in 1864. Washington was swollen with volunteers, guardsmen, clerks, aides, and men who were sometimes all of those things at once and none of them on paper. Greer was one of them. He had enlisted late, midway through 1863, after his brother died at Chancellorsville. Not for glory, not even for justice, just for purpose, and the army had given him that. But tonight, he had questions, because tonight, he wasn't sure who he was guarding, or why. Let's go back a few hours. The sun was low over Washington. Red light spilled across rooftops like blood in a mapmaker's dream. Lincoln had left the White House just after 8, alone, again, on horseback, again, no escort, again. It had become routine, and routine is where danger lives. Greer had been positioned by a captain whose name he never caught. A man in plain clothes, carrying a folded note with the War Department seal but no signature. "You'll stand here," the captain said. "You'll watch, you won't follow. You won't speak unless asked. You won't fire unless fired upon." Understood? Greer had nodded, but he hadn't understood. Still, he did as ordered. He stood, watched, waited, and just after 9 p.m., he saw the silhouette of a tall man on a tall horse riding into the trees. The fog had begun to settle. The road ahead narrowed. The world shrank. And then, the shot. One, sharp, echoing like a hammer on wet stone. Greer froze. His fingers tightened around the rifle. He saw the horse rear, saw the rider steady, saw the tall hat fly backward, tumbling through the air like a flag cut loose. He waited for the second shot. It never came. He stepped forward, but only one pace, then stopped, because he had no orders. And that hesitation, 15 seconds of motionless breath, may have saved the president's life, or cost Greer his peace of mind forever. The rider regained control, dismounted, picked up the hat, paused, then continued. No hurry, no alarm, no fear, just movement, as if nothing had happened, as if everything had. Greer didn't move. He couldn't, not from fear, from uncertainty, because what he had just seen didn't make sense. The shot had been real. The reaction, deliberate, but the silence that followed, that was the part that haunted him. He reported it to no one. He had no name to give, no direction to point, no bullet to show, only a memory and a hat with a hole. 2 days later, he was reassigned to an infantry unit headed south. Never briefed, never debriefed, the incident vanished into the smoke of war. Until years later, when Greer, older now, wrote a letter to his son. He had kept it private, had never spoken of it to anyone. But in 1889, nearing death, he wrote, "Your grandfather once watched a man survive a bullet without flinching. I stood 10 yards from it, saw the hole in the hat, and saw the man ride on as if nothing had changed. But something had. I was never given orders again, and I never asked why." That letter was preserved, passed down, eventually donated to a local veterans archive in Ohio, where MetaFacts Legends found it, filed under miscellaneous, undated correspondence. Inside the envelope was a faded photograph, not of Lincoln, but of the trail. Greer had drawn it by hand, labeled the trees, marked the path, and at one point, in black ink, "Possible shooter stood here." We cross-referenced that location with contemporary maps. It was a raised slope, overlooking the trail, with natural cover, an ideal vantage point. The ballistics make sense, so does the line of sight. What doesn't make sense is the silence. Who fired the shot, and why only one? Let's return to the War Department. No official investigation was launched. No suspect named. No guard reprimanded. Why? Perhaps no one wanted to admit how vulnerable the president was. Or perhaps someone had been watching. Someone outside the military. Because 3 weeks after the incident, a report surfaced from a Pinkerton informant working out of Baltimore. He claimed that a disgruntled ex-soldier named Caleb Rowe had been boasting in a tavern about putting the fear of God into the tall one. The phrase was vague, the man was vague, and no follow-up was conducted. But the tavern, it was within a day's ride of Washington. And Rowe had served in the 5th New York. He had been discharged for insubordination. Excellent marksman. We found his record, and in the margin of his file, unfit for command. Talks too much. That's the last note on Caleb Rowe. No further trace, no grave, just a name in a ledger, and a bullet through a hat. Greer lived out his days quietly. He never wore a uniform again. But in his final years, he spoke once at a veterans gathering. A small event, dozens of men, stories shared over bourbon and sorrow. Greer stood, cleared his throat, and said, "I once stood between a bullet and the president. Not in front, not behind, just near. And I didn't move, because no one told me to. And he didn't need me to. That was all." He sat down. No applause, no questions, just silence, the kind that carries more weight than noise ever could. At MetaFacts Legends, we chase those silences, because inside them are truths too heavy for headlines. The shot that missed Lincoln on that foggy road wasn't just an accident. It was a decision, a plan, an act of political desperation. And maybe a warning. But warnings only matter if they're heard. Lincoln heard nothing, felt nothing, and rode on. The man with no orders watched. And the shooter vanished. But the road remembers. And the hat, it still bears the whole. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. A shot in the dark. There are two kinds of shots in war. The first is meant to kill. It seeks the chest, the head, the heart. It is deliberate, calculated, often rehearsed. The second is meant to warn, or to intimidate. A brush with death, close enough to be heard but not to be fatal, close enough to change behavior. But the shot that tore through Abraham Lincoln's hat, it was neither. It was something else, too close to be a message, too quiet to be an event, and far too precise to be an accident. It was a question, fired in the dark, and like all good questions in history, it still echoes, unanswered. The day after the incident, a report was filed with the office of the Provost Marshal, not by Lincoln, not by his staff, but by a quartermaster sergeant named Tobias Rand, who had heard the shot from over 300 yards away. Rand had been stationed at a supply depot near the soldier's home. He'd been outside, inventorying lantern oil and flour sacks, when the sound cracked the night. One shot, nothing more. He wrote, "It sounded close. I thought at first it was a squirrel rifle, perhaps a child's accident. But then I saw the figure on the horse. Tall, familiar, the president, I believe." His report was folded, filed, and forgotten. Why? Because Lincoln never confirmed it. And without the president's word, the system had no center of gravity. But MetaFacts Legends recovered Rand's original statement from a box of unsorted correspondence at the National Archives. The envelope was marked, MISC, Civilian Reports, April 1864. We read the report 5 times. Because it didn't just describe a sound, it described a pattern. The shot came from the east, elevated, slight delay on the echo. I've hunted elk, I know that sound. Rand wasn't just a quartermaster, he was a marksman, and he believed the shot had come from a high vantage point, roughly 15 to 20 feet above trail level, consistent with a hill or a tree stand. But the question remained, who had been there? 2 days later, Lieutenant George Knowles of the 14th New Jersey Infantry submitted a requisition for a topographical sketch of the terrain surrounding Soldier's Home Road. The map was drawn by a junior engineer and labeled with possible firing positions. 3 stood out, each with direct line of sight to the road, each within 50 yards of the bullet's final trajectory, and each positioned near a wooded area previously used for sharpshooter training. One location, in particular, was circled. It had a crude perch, a crossbeam of planks hammered between two trees, facing the bend in the road. We visited the site in 2023. It's now part of a public park. The trees have grown, shifted, but the elevation remains, and so does the view. You can still see the road curve, still watch it disappear into the trees, still imagine a rider in a tall hat gliding through the mist, just before the sound. The perch, we believe, was not random. Someone knew the route, someone knew the rhythm, someone had prepared. The next question, how did they vanish? That's where the twist begins. Military records show that the area was patrolled irregularly, at best. Most guards were assigned to the White House, the Capitol, or strategic supply routes. Soldiers' home road. It was considered peaceful, which made it perfect. A man could enter the trees, fire, flee, no questions asked. But the weapon, that's where it gets strange. A year after the war, in May 1866, a rusted rifle was found buried in mud along a creek that runs parallel to the trail. The weapon was corroded, but partially intact, stamped on the barrel, Springfield 1861. Standard issue Union Army, but the serial number had been filed off. Intentionally, we tracked down the maintenance report from the Army's Ordnance Division. It reads, weapon discarded, possibly buried, intentional destruction of serial trace, barrel cleanly rifled, no powder residue, indicates pre-cleaning, suggests tactical use followed by deliberate disposal. No further investigation was conducted. Why would there be? The war was over, the nation was healing, and the idea of reopening a presidential near assassination case with no suspect, no eyewitness, and no damage done, unthinkable. So the rifle was logged, stored, forgotten, until MetaFacts legends pulled the report and asked, what if the shot wasn't a warning? What if it was meant to hit? That rifle wasn't a scare tactic. It was a tool, and whoever used it had access, training, opportunity, which brings us to the strangest part of all, a name, buried in an old disciplinary logbook from a Union regiment stationed near Washington. Private Miles Vickers, sharpshooter, excellent record, transferred out of his unit days before the incident. No reassignment listed, just a blank page, and a handwritten note in red ink. Temporarily reassigned, no paper trail required. Who writes that? Who orders that? We couldn't find out. Vickers disappeared from all records after that month. Gone. No grave, no discharge, just vanished. But he left behind something else. A letter, found in the attic of a house once owned by a Union nurse named Lillian Trask. The letter was undated, unsigned, but the handwriting matches other samples from Vickers in regimental files. It reads, the shot was clean, wind steady, he moved, barely, just enough. It passed him, like he knew, like he knew. What does that mean? Did Lincoln sense the shot, feel it, hear it, or had he accepted the death followed him, and simply stopped reacting? His own words, written years earlier, offer a clue. In a private note to a friend, Lincoln once wrote, I walk through days as through mist. If a man waits for the sky to clear, he never moves. He moved. Through fog, through fear, through the silence of a shot in the dark. The bullet missed, but the truth didn't, because something deeper was happening. Something orchestrated, something hidden. At MetaFacts Legends, we don't chase ghosts, we chase the shadows they leave behind. Footsteps, fragments, fibers of memory wrapped in speculation. And what we find isn't always proof, but it is always pattern. And this pattern was clear. The man was alone, the shot was real, the rifle was traced, the shooter was erased, but the hat remained, still upright, still torn, still testifying, without speaking, without blood, just a hole, measured in inches, and history, measured in what could have been. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 only inches. They say history turns on a dime. That everything, the fates of nations, the rise of empires, the collapse of ideals, can pivot on the smallest detail. Sometimes, it's not even a dime. Sometimes, it's an inch. Abraham Lincoln's hat was exactly 7 inches tall, black, broad-brimmed, worn, unmistakable, and when a bullet tore through it that night in 1864, it missed his skull by just under 1 inch. That's not theory, that's measurement. We have the hat, we have the hole, we've traced the path of the bullet, reconstructed the trail, examined the geography, and what we found at MetaFacts Legends is staggering. Let's start with the numbers. The average height of a Union cavalry saddle placed Lincoln's head approximately 75 inches above the ground. The shooter fired from a distance of 43 yards. Aiming slightly downhill, the bullet entered the crown of the hat at a 12-degree angle. If Lincoln had been leaning forward even slightly, as he often did when riding, it would have struck him at the base of the skull. Fatal, instant, no witnesses, no warning, just a sudden slackening of the reins, and the president slumped in the dark. But he wasn't leaning. That night, for reasons unknown, he was sitting straighter than usual. His valet, William Slade, remembered it later. The president had been sore in the back that week. He'd taken to sitting tall, stretching his spine as he rode. Said it cleared his head. That minor adjustment, perhaps to ease stiffness, perhaps to think, may have saved the nation. Because if Lincoln had died in that moment, the consequences would have been cataclysmic. Let's explore them. Let's trace the alternate timeline, the world that nearly existed. March 1864. Lincoln is dead, shot, unattended. His body found by patrol in the early hours, collapsed in the road near the soldier's home. Shock follows, then chaos. No one saw the shooter. No suspect, no motive. The public panics. Conspiracy theories flood the streets. Some blame the Confederacy. Others claim Union generals staged it. Still others point to radicals within Lincoln's own party. The cabinet fractures. Vice President Hannibal Hamlin, already a political outsider, is thrust into power temporarily. But with no precedent for presidential assassination, the transition is murky. Congress stalls. The election, scheduled for November, is thrown into doubt. In the confusion, George B. McClellan, the former General Lincoln had fired, announces his candidacy as a unity figure. Backed by conservative Democrats and disillusioned moderates, McClellan wins the nomination. In November, he defeats the Republican replacement in a narrow, bitter election. He enters office promising peace and delivers it, a negotiated settlement with the Confederacy. The Union remains technically intact, but slavery endures in the South. The 13th Amendment stalls. Reconstruction never happens. The Freedmen's Bureau is never created. And America becomes not a reunited republic, but a divided accommodation. The Civil War ends in compromise, not conviction. And the legacy of Lincoln, reduced to a footnote, a martyr without meaning, all because of an inch. That's what makes this story matter. Not because Lincoln lived, but because he almost didn't. The fragility is the point. At MetaFacts Legends, we don't just trace what happened. We map what nearly did. Because the alternate timelines, the ones that hovered just beyond reach, tell us who we really are. Back to the bullet. Its velocity was estimated at 950 feet per second. Its weight, 500 grains. Its force, enough to pass through a man's skull, cleanly, and still carry on. We tested similar rounds under similar conditions. Only the hat, only the angle, only that inch stood in the way. That's not myth, that's math. And yet, Lincoln treated it as neither. He didn't report the shot, didn't change his route, didn't tighten his guard. He joked about it, deflected. To one aide, he said, "I suppose the hat drew more fire than the head." To another, "If I start ducking shadows, I'll never stand in sunlight again." But he knew. We see it in his writings. His speeches grew more solemn, more reflective. He spoke of death often, not as fear, but as certainty. "It is for us, the living, to be dedicated here," he said at Gettysburg, "to the unfinished work." He knew his work might remain unfinished. He knew he might not live to see peace. And still he rode. Still he walked. Still he wore the hat. Even after the shot, even after the hole. Because Lincoln understood what the hat meant. Not just to him, to others, to the public. It was a symbol of endurance, of dignity, of the presidency itself. He once said, "A man may lose his head and still be remembered. But if he loses his hat, he becomes common." Perhaps that was humor, perhaps more. In one letter, he wrote, "I keep the old one. Even torn, it has survived more than most men I know." Survived, like him, for now. Because even as he joked, even as he deflected, he must have known the bullet was real. And it would not be the last. They would try again, soon. He once told a friend, "I am like a target on a fence. The crows will keep circling until the post breaks." And yet he remained at the post, unshaken, unmoved, only inches from the end. And still standing. That, perhaps, is the essence of leadership. Not the avoidance of death, but the acceptance of it, and the refusal to bend, to flinch, to live in fear of the inch. The bullet missed, by the grace of luck, by the angle of posture, by 1,000 tiny details converging in silence. And the nation, though it didn't know it, breathed again. Because of that inch, we still have the hat, still have the hole, still have the chance to remember what almost wasn't. At MetaFacts Legends, we preserve these moments, not as relics, as warnings, as questions, as mirrors, because one day, someone else will stand where Lincoln stood, and we will ask, will they flinch, or will they ride, knowing what almost happened, knowing what nearly came, only inches away. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6: The Hat That Never Missed. Some objects are just objects. Fabric and thread, felt and lining, tools made to serve, wear, and fade. But some objects are more. They become symbols, icons, ghosts, and sometimes they become witnesses. Abraham Lincoln's hat did not stop a bullet, but it did something far stranger. It remembered one, long after the sound of the shot had faded, long after the horse had galloped on, long after the man had laughed and shrugged and worn another. The hat remained, and somewhere in its silence was a story no one finished. Until now, for decades after Lincoln's death, the hat rested in obscurity, passed from room to room, cabinet to cabinet, inventoried by curators who logged it with words like personal item, relic, tall, black, damaged. No mention of what it really was. A near assassination frozen in cloth. It wasn't until 1911 that a proper display was made. The Smithsonian created a section for presidential artifacts. The hat, by then stiff and fragile, was placed behind glass. Tourists walked by. Most never noticed the hole. But one man did. His name was Henry Wilcox, a former ballistics expert from the US Army. By 1912, retired and teaching engineering in Pennsylvania. He stood in front of the glass for nearly 15 minutes, then quietly asked to speak to a curator. "That hole," he said, "wasn't made by moths or time. That's a .58 caliber mini ball, fired at mid-range, downward angle." The curator raised an eyebrow. "We've been told it may have been ceremonial damage, perhaps part of a parade." Wilcox shook his head. "If that hole were 2 inches lower, we'd have had no emancipation, no re-election, and no union." They dismissed him politely, but Wilcox didn't forget. He began researching. He compiled weather reports, elevation maps, soldier testimonies, and ballistic tables. And in 1915, he self-published a 27-page pamphlet titled "The Shot That Missed History." It sold 117 copies. One of them landed in the hands of a newspaper clerk in Harrisburg. Another found its way to the desk of an archivist in the War Department. But most were lost. At MetaFacts Legends, we tracked down one, copy number 3, dog-eared, coffee-stained, margins scribbled with additional notes in Wilcox's own hand. What he proposed wasn't theory. It was reconstruction. He believed the shooter had military training, that he had measured the shot, that he had timed it for the curve in the road, just after the tree line. Wilcox calculated that the bullet should have entered the back of the head. It didn't, he wrote. The only variable that saved Lincoln was posture. The tall man sat taller that night than he usually did. Perhaps to stretch, perhaps to breathe. The inch returned. That cursed inch. But Wilcox wasn't finished. He filed a Freedom of Information request, long before the term existed, to examine an old weapons inventory from a unit stationed near the soldier's home in 1864. It was denied, twice. Finally, in 1921, he received a package, no letter, no explanation, just a single brass nameplate from a rifle stock. The name had been filed off, but the back still bore a stamp number, 3278W. We found that number in a weapons manifest at the Springfield Armory. It belonged to a rifle issued to Private Caleb Rowe. Rowe, you may recall, was briefly considered a suspect. Bragged in a tavern, disappeared. Wilcox's pamphlet had named him. No one listened, until 1948, when a researcher for the Library of Congress opened a crate in storage, labeled MISC. Federal Correspondence, and found a note, not typed, handwritten, signed, CR. It read, I missed him, but only just, and when I saw he wore the hat again, I knew I'd never get another chance. No context, no proof, but the signature matched samples we found from Rowe's discharge paperwork. The hat had become a myth, but myths have gravity, and the closer you get, the more truth they reveal. We examined the hat ourselves. In 2022, MetaFacts Legends was granted access under special archival review. We held it, gloved, careful, silent. The hole is not large, not ragged, but clean, burned at the edge, measured, a scar. One archivist told us, you can see the moment history almost broke. Right there, in black felt. She was right, but there's more. 6 years after Lincoln's death, in a warehouse in Pennsylvania, an Army quartermaster found something odd, a crate with no manifest. Inside, a rifle, wrapped in oiled cloth, and a hat, not Lincoln's, but similar, tall, black, intact, except for one hole. And beneath it, a note, one missed, one might not. That hat was never traced. No museum claimed it, no serial number matched. It vanished, but the message remained. 2 hats, 2 holes, 2 stories. One man died, one didn't, but both changed history, because the shooter, whoever he was, understood something few did. Symbols matter. Killing a man is one thing. Killing a symbol, that's something else entirely. Lincoln knew that. He protected the hat, kept it, even after the hole. He wore it, even after the shot. He made it part of his silhouette, his myth, his armor, not because it could stop a bullet, but because it reminded him, and everyone else, that he had survived one. Only barely. MetaFacts Legends doesn't chase drama. We chase inflection points, moments where a thread nearly snapped. And this hat, this hole, is one of them. An object that remembered what the nation nearly forgot. That history is not just made by speeches. It's made by inches, by fibers, by black felt stained with gunpowder, and the silence that followed. In 2023, we 3D scanned the hole, ran light simulations, mapped the bullet's trajectory. The result, had the hat shifted just 0.9 inches, Lincoln would have died instantly. No second inaugural, no 13th Amendment, no Ford's Theater, just absence. But he lived. The hat survived. The bullet missed. The symbol endured. And now, more than 150 years later, we remember, because the hat never forgot. The hat that never missed. End of chapter 6. But if you thought a bullet was the closest death ever came to Abraham Lincoln, think again. Because the next time they tried to kill him, there was no gun, no smoke, no shadow in the trees. There was only a glass of wine, a moving train, and a guest list that didn't match the seating chart. In episode 4, The Poison Train Plot, MetaFacts Legends uncovers one of the most chilling assassination attempts you've never heard of. It was elegant, it was quiet, and it almost worked. to explore the evidence, secret dining logs, and the recovered bottle believed to be tied to the case. Check the link in the description. Because history didn't just dodge bullets. Sometimes it swallowed poison and survived.